welcome everyone to the PraxisAuril Key and Coffee session. I'm Alasdair Cameron, I'm Director of Engagement. Tamsin, do you want to say hello?
Hi everyone, I'm Tamsin Mann. Oh, sorry, we've got, that's right. Tamsin Mann, Director of Policy and Communications at PraxisAuril.
Okay, the webinar has been recorded as usual for those who aren't able to make it. They'll be able to catch up. We've muted everybody's mics and we've turned all your cameras off. If you want to make a comment or ask a question, please, if you can use the raise hand function. Hopefully Dan can find it this week if he needs it. If not, use the chat, whatever, if you've difficulty finding it, anything you can do to grab our attention, and we'll try and come to you. The chat is available throughout, so please make use of that. As usual, Tamsin and I will have a bit of a discussion, and then we'll come round and look for comments and questions from the floor. So this week we're looking at a state of the art papers from the Enterprise Research Centre. These SOTA reviews from ERC are a great way to get a quick summary of the kind of academic literature in some relevant areas, especially if you don't have time to read all the academic papers. They do reflect on theory, so it's really important, even more so than ever this week, that we get your insights into your practical experiences. Is what we talk about and what's mentioned in the SOTA papers consistent or contradictory with your own experiences? So please do pitch in and help us. So the SOTAs we're looking at, we did post one up, number 41. There's another one that I noticed as I was downloading 41 to read 42, which is also interesting. We might come to that. They're both on effectively SME engagement. It's a perennial issue for universities. We're constantly troubled and there's a desire from government for us to consistently do more and more in this area. So the first one, number 41, which came out in June, is University and Industry Collaboration. Are SMEs different? From Andrew Johnston, Sheffield Business School. The review looks at the effect firm size has on university industry collaborations to see if SMEs are distinct. The findings suggest that firm size has a significant impact on the type of collaboration, the outcome, the perception of barriers, and the reliance on the local university. So just reflecting on the things I picked up when I went through it. From a UK context, it said that SMEs have been found to rate unis as less important sources of knowledge compared to customers and suppliers. And that kind of backs up the discussion we had last week around the UK Innovation Survey, where university collaboration was actually quite low down on the list. Another thing that I thought we might want to go into, Tamsin, was so SMEs do engage, but sometimes in a less formal way compared to larger firms.
Yeah, I mean, I think the paper raises lots of things that did definitely chime with my experience of trying to engage with SMEs when I was working at Cambridge. I mean, the first thing to say is that it does make clear that SME is an incredibly broad business definition, and that's one of the things that are problematic. And this finding that they perhaps have a less formal way of interacting with universities is partly a consequence of that, because if you're talking about a micro business, which might rely on the fact that perhaps it is a spin out or a spin out that's a few years down the line and is now kind of feeding back into research itself. It's more reliant on individual connections that it will have with its local institution, and then it also kind of finds slightly different conclusions about a more medium-sized company where there's a more established R&D function, but it's not such a large company that R&D function doesn't kind of have a doesn't inform the culture of the whole company still. And I think that was another really important finding for me, that medium size of company is more aligned with what we're all trying to achieve through knowledge exchange, even compared to larger companies.
Just on that, the less formal interaction. We talk a lot about HEBSIS and quantitative data to back up how great we are. If SMEs are engaging in a less measurable way or informal way, how that's difficult to square with HEBSIS.
It is, and it shows again how the data is very contextual, but also digging around in the HEBSIS data, around SME engagement, and it's quite hard to draw conclusions from the way HEBSIS is presented at the moment. HEFCE used to do a lovely report when the HEBSIS data was put out, but they haven't done that for the last couple of years. And they used to focus on SME engagement. But I did manage to establish that, by the HEBSIS measures, which are of course just around income and quantity of interactions, SME engagement has, in fact, there's quite a steep rise over the last couple of academic years. So that's good news. When you look into it more closely, you find that actually most of that increase is down to Oxford University. So, we need a better sector view of what's going on. But yes, if the interactions are informal and perhaps not reported because they're on an individual basis rather than being governed by a contract, for example, so they haven't yet reached that point of reporting, then the amount of SME engagement is going to be lower than that which is reported through HEBSIS. So that's slightly problematic, but maybe not something we should worry about too much.
Yeah, okay. So another thing that I thought was quite interesting, that for a large number of the interactions or the benefits from engaging with a university, so around knowledge and training, they were totally unrelated to size. So the same benefits accrued to SMEs as did large companies.
Yeah, I think that probably, I don't know whether that might relate to sector, but that's, possibly needs more digging around. I think maybe it is to do with the fact that most of the collaborative research was with these more medium-sized companies, and maybe if you looked more at the large companies, it would, you'd find more in common between the medium-sized companies and the large companies than you do with those medium-sized and the micro businesses. So I think again that size factor, but it does, at the end of the SOTA, the number 41 anyway, it does talk about whether, SME as a catch-all, it's just using the size as a definition, but we should be thinking about turnover, we should be thinking about sector, so that we have a better understanding of when we're talking about SME engagement, what we actually mean and what we're talking about, and defining this kind of problem or perceived problem of engagement in a more intelligent way, I think. Yeah.
So Barry's just posted something on the chat talking about it's impossible to consider SMEs as a homogenous group, which I think we would say. And actually, when we looked at the last point that I had on this paper was around this question of proximity, which I had in my mind as like SMEs would predominantly work with local universities, but actually from the review of the kind of literature of what's in the SOTA, it says there's no real, the distinction between SME and large doesn't exist, but it tends to be micro companies and other companies with.
And that makes sense if you think about, so if you think of a micro business, possibly, if it is a spin out or a startup, it's possibly in a university incubator, and it's in a local science park, and therefore, of course, proximity will play a role. Although just that resource to go and look further afield might not be there, but again, it might be that familiarity and that those individual links with a more local institution will play a part. And as a company grows in size, it might become more selective about the kind of knowledge exchange it needs and about where it's going to be prepared to look for that. There's in another SME paper, I don't think it's number 42, but it might have been, it talks about the importance of international collaborations, and you can see that as a company grows, its ambitions start to grow as well, and it might then locality might not be such a a big factor in where it chooses to go for collaboration. But yeah, I mean, I think there's been a bit of an assumption about locality and SMEs for quite a long time. It's become almost an urban myth, I think. So it's quite good to see that in this review, you know, it was highlighted that the evidence is a bit contradictory actually on that point.
Yeah, and in fact it makes the comment that large companies are less likely to collaborate with local unis. So again, that might be just where, well, I guess the place agenda is so you know, nuanced that it becomes very difficult to draw big things.
But also it will relate to sector and industry, won't it? So if you're an SME that is in a particular sector and your local university or universities happen to have expertise in that sector, then obviously you might go local. But if they don't, then you're going to look somewhere else. There's no point engaging with your local university just because it's local. It's got to have the right kind of expertise. So. Yeah.
Okay. Will we have a quick comment on 42?
Yeah. So this was slightly different, wasn't it? This was looking at collaboration processes, and so when SMEs collaborate, how they collaborate, which was about which did touch on that individual versus institutional relationships and how relationships started, which tended to be through maybe serendipitous encounters and using more that kind of network factor, where people were talking the same language and had the same expectations and understandings about what they needed. So, and you picked up on the fact that relationships might be more organic, so less brokered, more organic, up to a certain point where a contract does need putting in place or something needs to be more formalized. Or I know that, you know, my experience, a relationship might start off between two individuals, but at some point you felt that if this was going to be an enduring relationship, it needed to be organisation to organisation, so that you weren't affected by people moving on. You know, that personal relationship wasn't taken outside of the institution. So that's when the brokerage came in.
Yeah. So I mean, taking the brokerage to the next level would then be the kind of various digital platforms that have been introduced. You know, what does that mean? And I kind of was reflecting on it after we spoke, to think, you know, what is the current situation? Does that change that? Because, you know, these sorters were put together in, you know, the world that was, the world that is a very different place. So I mean, from an online.
Yeah, I mean, I think through personal experience, I've developed a skepticism of online brokerage platforms. But yeah, and I don't know how successful Confer is in this respect, for example. So it would be interesting to see some metrics from that platform and how their SME engagement is going and what people are getting out of that. And I know there are other things in the pipeline that might be addressing this space. And I suppose, you know, if we are all going to be working from home, then you know, for, well, even the short term, then a brokerage platform is one way to reduce that distance. And it should be a way to reduce effort and finding things more straightforward. But at the end of the day, I think you need to shake somebody's hand, you know, when we can shake hands again, or look somebody in the eye. I don't think you can do everything online. Yeah, I don't know.
It was quite interesting listening to the Shed Talk this morning. And Graham saying that how he'd spent years telling people that they couldn't do this stuff online, and within 2 months he was his biggest friend. So it is, if we're looking for any positives in the current situation, then that kind of change of mindset over a very short period of time has been quite profound.
Yeah. I think the trouble with doing everything online and having an online brokering platform is that the platform has to somehow allow you to discover things that you didn't necessarily know that you were looking for. I think that's what's good about, when you have industry facing events, you might be addressing a particular topic, but hopefully you're addressing it in quite a broad way. And there is that room for somebody having a bit of a light bulb moment, not necessarily because they're being presented with something which answers a direct question, but because it answers something slightly tangential. And that's what I think we lose out on through the online stuff. You can't necessarily have that kind of, it is serendipity, isn't it? But also meeting peers, not just meeting the academics, but meeting other people in industry, which the paper 42 certainly talks about that networking effect. It's your peer group in a business sense saying, well, we did this with academic X, and it was great. It worked great. So you should try that as well. Or, you know, just recommending a particular funding program or something like that. So that's still really important.
So the one other point I've got written down here was that I thought was interesting was outcomes from the SME university collaborations are more likely to be focused on increasing the absorptive capacity rather than producing things. So it was more about the capabilities of the organisation rather than a defined widget, if you want.
Yeah, and I think, well, I don't know. Yeah, that's where, again, you know, looking at the HEBSIS data, it's impossible to know what any of these interactions actually are. And, you know, clearly you need to look at case studies and things. But facilities and equipment, for example, has often been kind of thought of as a way in for SMEs, and that's kind of increasing capacity. But CPD as a way of increasing business understanding. So when I rummaged around in my SME folder, I found an impact report, which I'd kind of forgotten about, which was a project from the University of Bedfordshire back in about 10 years ago, and that was about technology road mapping for SMEs, but also innovation benchmarking. So that was a very practical way for SMEs to understand their business and to understand how they might grow their business, not necessarily saying this is a solution and you should use it, but kind of helping them to find their own problems and the things they wanted to achieve in a peer group or in a sector, you know, in terms of evolving through a sector and developing a product or service. And then the academics working alongside them to say, well, we've got insight into this particular method of working, or why don't you recruit some, you know, bright sparks into this area of your business, or why don't you improve something? It might be supply chain, it might not be about the product, it might be about how that gets to market or how it gets produced. So yeah, I think business schools probably have a very large role here, and that's not something that's mentioned in either of the reports, actually. I mean, it doesn't probably go into that much detail, but I sense that if Jenny Shawley was on the call, which I don't think she is, she might be able to give us a bit more insight into, you know, the business side, school side of things here as well.
Okay, and there's a couple of comments in the chat about you know, online dating type things. It seems to have worked quite well. One thing that I wanted to pick up before we open out for questions and comments, so 42 talks about proximity or spatial proximity, to give it its nice title, but the evidence appears totally scant around it, you know, and it kind of does give it the caveat that it's probably affected more by contextual factors than anything else. So again, really difficult to draw a firm conclusion. I
think it's so difficult because even if an SME does engage with its local university, you come back to this problem of where does the impact actually happen anyway? Or if they interact with or partner with a university that's overseas, the impact might happen locally, but then the partnership is counted as an overseas one. So it's kind of a bit nonsensical. I did look at one, you know, I was looking at some of the, you know, we haven't talked about European funding and all the SME you know, programs they have arising from EU funding, which presumably we won't be able to access after the end of the year. But I did see that Anglia Ruskin has got, and its partners have been awarded another tranche of Keep Plus funding, which is a program that I'd kind of forgotten about. But that's interesting because it is about a more, you know, it's only applicable in certain LEP areas of those partner universities. So that is about SME engagement kind of regionally and having it's all about having a more local impact. So that's something I'd kind of like to look at a bit more. And maybe, you know, when we're looking for examples of how universities are interacting, I mean, it's so hard to keep in mind all the different programs that are running at any one time, but something like Keep Plus, and I'm sure there are many others that have been running for a long time, and they just get, you know, the more new things come on board, everything gets kind of pushed down the agenda. So it's good to have these kind of reviews, you know, coming round time and again. We get a bit tired of apparently the same topics being reviewed time and again, but actually it does serve to remind us that this has all been going on for quite a long time and we all actually have a lot of evidence that we can bring.
Okay, that's great. As informative as usual, Tamsin. Is there anybody who wants to make any comments or questions on what we've discussed, or reflect on your own experience?
I can see Dan has posed a question about SME proximity and whether anybody's analysed their own.
Dan's found the hand again.
Okay, shall we let him?
Remember to unmute yourself, Dan. Or maybe you can't. Maybe I've got to. I think I took away your privileges. Sorry.
Yeah, so I found the hand but couldn't unmute. That's good. No, it's just, I think both are really interesting papers, but I'm just conscious reading what is the state of the art literature, how old it is, but also just how much data that the kind of PraxisAuril members are sitting on that could add a significant contribution to some of this stuff in terms of proximity of SMEs, just as taking one issue. And I think the complicating thing there is, of course, many of the programs that run and are targeted at SMEs have a geographical restriction on them, either because of ERDF funding or some other dimension. But if you kind of take that out, it's a really interesting question as to what is the kind of cause and effect around proximity decisions by SMEs. A few years ago, we had University of Nottingham, when I was there, had a local business network, and we actually discovered when we looked at where some of the businesses who came along to that network, they weren't as local as we thought they ought to be or would be. They were actually kind of, some of them were well over an hour's sort of distance from that group, so it could be quite surprising. But I'm conscious that there's probably more information in the university's own kind of HEPSIS return, if they kind of married up the location data, than is probably better quality information than is in all of those literature references that we've seen there.
Yeah, the HEPSIS data is always quite frustrating if you start to dig below the headlines, because if you work in a university, you know the context of your own data, but it's quite hard to bring it out in the headlines. And if you just look at the numbers, it's I must go and find out what Oxford University has been doing with its SMEs recently, because the number has shot up. Its reported figures have shot up. But it's interesting to see, if you rank university engagement by value and you rank it by number of engagements in various categories, you get completely different rankings. So it's not as if the universities who have got more engagements are creating more income. There's not that relationship. So that's something I think that would be very interesting to explore as well.
Right, and so Claire's got her hand up as well, so let's see if we can, if she's going to come through.
Oh, hello everyone. Yeah, I was just going to pick up on the location of the SMEs and larger companies, which I thought was really interesting. I used to work at Nottingham Trent, and I know particularly there we had in the employability teams, when sort of looking for student placements, instead of targeting those locally who were already sort of inundated with other options, particularly through the different ERDF and ESF funding streams, they would look at where a lot of the students came from. So for Nottingham Trent, a lot of our students came from London areas, and actually so that they could take part in placements during the holidays or for their year-long placements, so they could afford to live at home and do the placements. It would be interesting to sort of see data around the different types of engagement and how SMEs are then in the locality. Yeah,
I think it's well, Andrew Johnston, who's the author of this report, these were two reports, is certainly, I mean, he may be on the call, I don't know, I hope he's going to watch the, we'll send him a link to the recording, because he's interested in understanding what more insights might be useful for us as practitioners, as well as, some of our sector stakeholders. And the ERC has got so much understanding of SMEs from lots of different angles that I think we can certainly point them, location is definitely one of those things to explore. But Alice, you were saying about KTPs as well, and all these different programs that SMEs can use, and you say that they were much bigger users of KTPs than I'd expected.
So yeah, SMEs, I think Innovate UK looks for about 75% of its 800 KTP portfolio to be with SMEs. So that's you've reminded me that's a good time for my KTP mug. So it is a big part. The one thing, I'm conscious we're running out of time, and the one thing I did want to, that we both went, when we talked about this, the question of cost or value for SME engagement with universities. A lot of the schemes with the exception of KDP, are here's a voucher, very little, if any, cost, apart from you know, in kind from the business, and it does worry me that it anchors the value at a pretty low level. So when you turn to something like a KTP and ask them to invest quite a significant amount of money, it then becomes quite difficult. So we're not addressing that kind of market failure of we don't understand the value that interaction can bring, because we've continually anchored it to a really low value. And there's nothing, well, the literature, you know, doesn't avoid it. There's no comments about that.
Well, I think we've said this before, I can't remember which talk we brought it up in, but this concept of value to the customer, I think, is unexplored across most of our KE modes. But yeah, I think there is an old HEFKE report about the value of engagement with SMEs, which I think puts an average value or average cost of about somewhere between £1,000 and £2,000 to SMEs. But that's based on HEBC data, so I don't think it's a particularly robust conclusion. And I suspect that, you know, again, if you separated out the micros and the medium-sized businesses, you'd have some outliers, but you'd get a more robust figure of, you know, what SMEs might be prepared to pay for interactions, rather than, yeah, as you say, relying on innovation vouchers. But clearly, lots of avenues for further research that we can set Andrew Johnson off on.
Yeah, well, I mean, I just worry when we've talked about, you know, grouping universities as one homogeneous one, we've talked about SMEs. Yeah. It's unfair to group them as a homogeneous. When you talk about large companies, which can go from anything from 250 to 50, 100,000, you know, that then becomes, that's another big thing. So it feels we artificially we try to put people in buckets to make it easier to analyse, and sometimes it just it destroys anything useful.
And I guess when the CAF metrics come online, you know, we'll see that's SME data spread across the CAF clusters, which may be helpful.
You know, at the minimum level, it would be interesting, rather than just saying it's an SME, if you just reported the number of employees and its turnover, and then you could draw whatever conclusion you wanted from it. And we would be able to see the variation within that, rather than grouping everything as SME. Well, you could do that artificially once you had the data, but at least you would get potentially our academic colleagues who want to nose around this data would find it a lot more useful. Right, we are rapidly running out of time.
We're starting to talk about data collection now, so let's not go down that line.
I fear that I promised Hamish McAlpine that we would fix the SME issue and move on to something more. Well, it's been a really interesting discussion. Thanks to all, for those who asked questions, they came on screen, made comments. It's really great. And for those of you who've been around listening to it, I hope you found that useful. And as usual, we can continue this conversation on our online community within the PraxisAuril site. Without that, it's just that's us. Thanks very much for attending, and hope to see you again soon. Stay safe. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.